Rome had words for cruelty too. So did every empire that wanted to keep its hands clean. But Japan's most efficient weapon here wasn't a rifle or a bayonet or even a prison gate. It was a word. Comfort. That single euphemism is the first violence, because the moment you accept the word, you accept the lie inside it. You imagine warmth, consent, choice, something private, something human, something that might even be complicated. And that is exactly what the system needed you to imagine, not the reality. A wartime mechanism built to function under pressure, scale across territories, and keep moving even when the victims stopped being able to speak about it. This story begins the way so many cover-ups begin, not with silence, but with a sentence designed to soften the truth. Comfort women. Say it slowly, and it almost sounds like a service. But if it was only that, if it was just prostitution, like defenders have tried to claim for decades, then here's the question that won't leave you alone. Why did international investigators, human rights institutions, and official statements describe it as something far darker, something closer to military sexual slavery than any normal transaction? Because words matter. And in war, words don't just describe reality. They manufacture it. They build a version of events that soldiers can live with, commanders can justify, and governments can deny later. That's why this isn't a story about bad individuals. Not primarily. This is a story about design, about how an army can take something unspeakable and make it repeatable. And repeatable things are always more terrifying than spontaneous cruelty. Because repeatable things become policy. You can hear it in the way the topic is argued. People don't debate it like a crime. They debate it like a rumor. They ask for proof, as if the victims were required to bring paperwork to survive. They demand perfect records from a system that had every incentive to destroy records. They hide behind uncertainty like uncertainty is innocence. But this isn't a rumor. It never was. There are admissions. There are reports. There are documented acknowledgments that military authorities were involved in establishing and managing these facilities, and that in many cases, recruitment was conducted against the women's will, through coercion, deception, and pressure. That alone should end the fantasy that this was simply private business happening near a battlefield. Because armies don't accidentally create infrastructure. They don't accidentally coordinate movement across occupied territory. They don't accidentally supervise a system and then pretend they never touched it. And yet, the most chilling part is what happens after you accept that it was organized. The next question becomes unavoidable. What does an organized system do to a person when the system is built to outlast their resistance? This is where the title stops being exaggeration and starts becoming literal. Because death is final. Death ends the suffering. But a system like this doesn't just aim to harm the body. It aims to damage the entire future. It aims to turn survival into a kind of punishment. To make the victim carry the war home long after the uniforms are gone. Long after the bombs stop, long after the world decides it's tired of hearing about it. That's why the phrase, worse than death, isn't just about what happened in the moment. It's about what happened after. The stigma, the silence, the isolation, the decades of being told you're lying, or exaggerating, or misremembering. And maybe the cruelest part? The way the world demands you relive it in public if you want their recognition. Imagine that bargain. If you speak, you are shamed. If you don't speak, you are erased. And while you are trapped in that double bind, governments debate vocabulary. They debate whether the system was forced. They debate whether the state was directly involved. They debate what counts as evidence. But the machine doesn't care about debate. The machine cares about function. So let's frame this the way prosecutors frame a crime. Not as a rumor, not as an argument, as a mechanism with stages. Because that's how it operated, and that's how we're going to expose it. How people were taken, deceived, pressured, and funneled into a pipeline. How movement across regions turned human beings into deliveries. How violence became scheduling, rules, surveillance, and control. How abuse becomes routine when it's written into operations. How survival didn't mean freedom, and how stigma and fear buried the truth for decades. How history itself became contested ground. How testimony was attacked, language was sanitized, and the victims were forced to fight for the right to be believed. That's the architecture. And it matters because when you see the architecture, you stop asking the wrong questions. You stop asking, was it a few bad men? And you start asking the question that terrifies every institution. Who built it? Who benefited? Who kept it running? Who looked away? This is why international reports didn't treat it like a private scandal. They treated it like a wartime human rights violation tied to military structures. Because that's what it was described as in those findings. And this is why official acknowledgments matter. Because once the state admits involvement, even partially, the conversation changes. The euphemism starts to crack. Comfort stops sounding harmless, and you begin to hear what it really was. A word designed to make the unimaginable sound manageable. But here's the final trap. Even when the world learns the truth, the system's last function still works. Because if you can't erase the crime, you can drown it in arguments. You can bury it under complexity. You can turn a human tragedy into a debate club. And while everyone argues, the survivors age. Their voices thin out. Their names disappear. Until the only thing left is the euphemism again, floating on the surface of history like a clean label on a contaminated bottle. So no, this isn't a story about the past. It's a story about how the past gets laundered. And if you want to understand how it happened, how it was made repeatable, scalable, and deniable, then we have to start where every machine starts. With intake, with recruitment, with the pipeline. Because the real question is not whether this was comfort. The real question is, how does an army turn bodies into logistics? War creates shortages. Not just food, not just of fuel, not just of ammunition. It creates a shortage of control. Armies move fast, occupy territory, and drag thousands of young men into environments where discipline fractures and brutality spreads like heat. Commanders begin to fear the same thing every occupying force fears: disorder inside their own ranks. So they look for solutions. And here's where the story takes its first truly procedural turn. Because the system did not begin as a random series of crimes committed in the shadows. It began as a logistical answer to a military problem, not a moral answer, a logistical one. The official language was clean, sanitized, almost corporate. Recruitment, employment, facilities, management. Words that make it sound like a labor project. But the reality underneath those words, as documented in investigations and acknowledged in official statements, was that many women were recruited against their will through coercion, deception, and pressure, often with the involvement of military authorities in the establishment and operation of the system. That's the first mechanism of the pipeline, the lie that opens the door. Because the easiest way to move people is not always through force. Sometimes it's through hope, through a promise, through a job offer that sounds like survival, through a chance that looks like escape from poverty, from hunger, from social collapse. You don't need chains when you can use desperation. And the genius of a pipeline is that it doesn't require every person involved to understand the whole machine. It only requires each person to do their small part. One intermediary, one recruiter, one broker, one official who signs a paper, one guard who looks away, one officer who calls it necessary. And then it becomes normal. That's the delayed payoff in the structure. We start with a manpower problem, and the reveal is that the solution wasn't informal. It was a system of intake, not chaos, a pipeline. Because when something is a pipeline, it has features, it has entry points, it has routes, it has filtering, it has transfers, it has documentation. And that's why the debate over voluntary versus forced often misses the deeper truth. A pipeline can include multiple methods at once. Some people are tricked, some are coerced, some are pressured by circumstances so extreme that choice becomes a word with no meaning. And the machine doesn't care which method you call it. The machine only cares that the pipeline keeps flowing. Here's how the language works. Watch it carefully. The official phrasing says, recruitment. The reality often looks like targeting vulnerability. The official phrasing says, work. The reality becomes capture through promises. The official phrasing says, transport. The reality becomes removal from community, isolation, dependency. This is pattern, disruption. It forces the viewer to constantly translate, to stay mentally active, to keep watching because every normal word hides a darker function. And this is where the legal technical pivot appears. Because the military did not simply want women present near troops. They wanted the process controlled. And that raises a mini mystery that pushes us forward. Why would an army want control over something it later tries to deny? Because control is not just about access. Control is about containment. Control is about reducing variables. If soldiers act on impulse, commanders lose discipline. If commanders lose discipline, the occupation destabilizes. If the occupation destabilizes, the war effort weakens. So the logic becomes cold. Turn disorder into administration. That is the DNA of every institutional crime, and the pipeline reflects that mindset. It uses intermediaries so responsibility becomes blurry. It uses movement so victims become invisible. It uses paperwork so the system can claim legitimacy. It uses euphemism so the conscience can sleep. And when the system is questioned later, the same design protects it. It was private contractors. It was local brokers. It wasn't the military. It wasn't official. But documented investigations have repeatedly focused on responsibility and patterns that point beyond random criminality, toward systemic involvement and accountability questions. That's why this isn't just history. It's architecture. The pipeline solves multiple problems at once. Problem 1, supply. The pipeline produces a steady flow of victims. Problem 2, distance. Transport removes victims from home networks, where people might search, intervene, resist. Problem 3, denial. Intermediaries create plausible distance between the command structure and the act. Problem 4, continuity. The pipeline can be adjusted and rerouted as fronts shift. And then comes the most important detail, one that reveals the true nature of the machine. A random crime doesn't need a pipeline. A crime of opportunity doesn't require a system of intake. Only a repeatable policy needs that. Only a machine that intends to run for months, then years, then across multiple territories. So when you hear the phrase, comfort women, understand what it really describes. Not a category of people, a category of processing. A term that hides the fact that a person was treated like an input. And this is where the viewer's anger changes shape. Because outrage is easy when the story is personal, but it becomes unbearable when the story is procedural. Because procedure means intention. Procedure means planning. Procedure means someone asked, "How do we make this work?" And someone else answered, "Like this." And then it worked. The pipeline was delivered, not perfectly, not cleanly, not without chaos, but it delivered enough to become embedded in wartime routine. And once something becomes routine, it stops feeling like a scandal inside the institution. It starts feeling like operations, which is why recruitment was only step one. Because the real horror isn't just how the pipeline begins. It's what happens when the pipeline ends, when the intake is complete and the system finally has what it wanted. Control over time, control over movement, control over the schedule. Recruitment was only the entrance. The real nightmare is what a system does once it owns the calendar. Once it can decide who eats, who rests, who moves, who speaks, and who disappears. Recruitment was only step one. The real horror is what a machine becomes when it starts managing human lives like inventory. And that is where we go next. Recruitment is how the pipeline begins. But management is where the pipeline becomes a machine. Because the moment an institution starts managing harm, scheduling it, supervising it, regulating it, it stops being a series of individual crimes and becomes something far more terrifying. A system that can run without emotion, without rage, without impulse, just routine. And routine is how horror survives inside bureaucracy. Here is the ladder you have to understand, because it explains why survivors describe this as something that followed them long after the war ended. Not a crime, a facility, not a facility, a network, not a network. A wartime function, that is the escalation, that is the truth hiding under the euphemism. Because if this was unofficial, if it was merely private business happening near military bases, then it should have looked chaotic, unregulated, inconsistent, hidden. But what appears again and again in the documentation and analysis is the opposite. Rules, transfers, oversight, control. And that raises the question that burns through every denial like acid. If it was unofficial, why did it behave like administration? Why were there structures that resemble management? Why did the system have consistency across space? Why did it require coordination? Why did it keep functioning as fronts moved, as units rotated, as territory changed hands? A rumor doesn't need logistics. A scandal doesn't need oversight. Only a machine does. This is where the harm becomes worse than death. Not because death is preferable, never because of that, but because the system's goal was not just to injure a person. The goal was to remove autonomy so completely that the victim's life no longer belonged to them. And once autonomy is removed, survival becomes a different kind of suffering. You wake up, but you don't control your day. You breathe, but you don't control your body. You speak, but your words don't change your fate. You resist, and the system responds. Not with anger, but with procedure. That's what the administration does. It doesn't argue with you. It processes you. The coldest part is how the machine creates an illusion of normality around something abnormal. Administration thrives on checklists, where a person is kept, when they are moved, who watches, who reports, what happens when someone disobeys. And once those decisions become part of a schedule, the crime stops looking like violence to the people running it. It starts looking like operations. This is why worse than death becomes psychologically coherent. Because a single violent event is trauma, But a scheduled system is captivity over time. It turns the future into a closed room. And the longer it continues, the more it changes the victim's relationship with reality itself. Hope becomes dangerous. Trust becomes impossible. Time becomes a weapon. This is what institutions do best. They make suffering predictable. And predictable, suffering breaks people in a different way than sudden cruelty. Now listen carefully to how denial collapses under its own logic. Defenders often say, it wasn't the military. It was brokers. It was contractors. It was local. But even if you try to hide behind intermediaries, you can't escape one basic fact. A network that follows an army is not independent of the army. An institution doesn't need to publicly announce ownership to exert control. It only needs access. It only needs enforcement. It only needs silence. And this is where the documentary tone matters. Because we're not dealing in vibes. We're dealing in patterns that have been examined by international human rights frameworks. UN documentation on this issue emphasized state responsibility, disclosure of information, apology, and education. Because the scale and structure of the system demanded more than private excuses. That's not the language used for a few bad actors. That's the language used when the harm is tied to a broader structure. And scholars have framed the system as connected to wartime political and military objectives. Part of how occupation and discipline were managed, not an incidental shadow economy. That framing matters because it explains the machine's logic. The machine is not built for pleasure. It is built for control. Control of troops, control of territory, control of reputation, control of consequences. And control always requires enforcement, which means surveillance, which means confinement, which means punishment for resistance, not as personal revenge, but as a deterrent, as a message to everyone inside the system. Your body is no longer a private place. Again, we don't need graphic details to understand the structure. The structure is already a confession. A person is removed from the community, isolated, monitored, managed, transferred, replaced. That's how the machine keeps running. And here is the most chilling part. Even when records are incomplete, the shape of the machine still shows through. Because institutions leave traces. Sometimes those traces are direct. Sometimes they're indirect. Sometimes they're missing. But missing records don't erase a pattern, especially when the pattern is echoed across testimonies, investigations, and institutional behavior. Where records exist, they point one way. Where records vanish, the pattern still remains. That's not conspiracy thinking. That's how historical accountability works when powerful institutions have incentives to sanitize the past. And this is where the story turns from wartime into something even darker. Because the machine doesn't end when the war ends. It ends when the institution admits it existed. It ends when the survivors are believed without being forced to perform their suffering like proof. It ends when the euphemism dies. And that is why comfort was never just a word. It was a shield, a linguistic bunker built around responsibility. And inside that bunker, administration could pretend it was order. Supervision could pretend it was discipline. Control could pretend it was a necessity. But survivors didn't live inside words. They lived inside the schedule, inside the rules, inside the system that treated their lives like a function. And when you understand that, you understand why the aftermath becomes its own chapter. Because war ends, armies retreat, governments sign papers, the world moves on. But systems like this don't always end. They do something worse. They shrink. They harden. They bury themselves in silence. War ends. Systems don't always end. they mutate into silence. The war ends the way wars always end for the people who survive them. Not with a clean ending, not with a ceremony, not with justice. It ends with release. And then the second sentence begins. Because for many survivors, the battlefield didn't follow them home as gunfire. It followed them home as silence, as shame they never chose, as a wound that couldn't be shown without being judged, as a past that made ordinary life feel impossible. Marriage, friendship, family, faith, even sleep. This is where the title becomes fully clear. Because the system didn't just take years, it tried to take the rest of a life. And when a person survives something that destroys their social standing, their safety, their future relationships, their ability to trust, survival itself can feel like punishment. Not because life isn't worth living, but because the world often refuses to make space for the truth. That's the second sentence. The first sentence was the machine. The second sentence was what came after: stigma, exclusion, denial, and the slow violence of being erased while still alive. You can measure this aftermath in the way survivors spoke or didn't speak for decades. Some never told anyone, not a spouse, not a child, not a friend, not because they forgot, but because memory wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was what the world would do to them if they spoke. The cruel paradox is this: silence protects you from judgment, but it also traps you with a trauma. And the longer silence lasts, the more it becomes a prison with no visible bars. This is where the story zooms out, because the aftermath wasn't only personal, it was political. And politics doesn't handle trauma gently. Politics handles trauma like a problem to be managed, like a liability, like a headline. And this is where the conflict engine ignites. Admissions versus walkbacks, apologies versus legal liability, recognition versus denial. The world wants simple stories, heroes and villains, endings and lessons. But this story refused to become simple, because simplicity would require something institutions avoid at all costs: a clean admission of responsibility. Not sympathy, not regret, responsibility. And so the aftermath became a second war, one fought with language, committees, statements, and the slow grinding gears of interpretation. Because once the machine is exposed, the institution has only a few moves left. One of them is delay. Another is dilution. Another is to turn the victim into a debate. That's why the decades after the war are filled with a strange, exhausting spectacle. Survivors aging in real time, while governments argue about vocabulary, as if the truth depends on the perfect word, as if the suffering becomes negotiable if the paperwork is incomplete. And then comes the delayed payoff in this chapter: atonement. The world hears about atonement and expects closure. Atonement sounds like a final page. Atonement sounds like healing. Atonement sounds like a door opening. But in this story, atonement becomes another contested battlefield, because it raises a brutal question. What counts as justice when the harm was systemic? This is where the Asian Women's Fund enters the narrative. In 1995, the Asian Women's Fund was established with the stated purpose of offering atonement and support for former comfort women, including measures described as medical and welfare support and letters of apology from Japan's Prime Minister. That is not nothing. It matters that it existed. It matters that it attempted to respond. It matters that apology letters were involved. But here's the pressure point, the part that keeps the wound open even when something is offered. Many survivors and advocates argued that it was not enough, or that it was structured in a way that avoided full legal responsibility. And this is where the tension becomes unbearable. Because the question stops being, was there an apology? The question becomes, was it an apology that changes the official record? Or an apology that manages the scandal? Was it designed to heal the victims? Or to protect the state? That is the contradiction that fuels everything that follows. And it's why the debate didn't end. Because survivors weren't only asking for money, they were asking for truth, for education, for public acknowledgement, for a world that would stop treating their lives like an inconvenient footnote. They were asking for something many governments fear more than compensation: a permanent historical verdict, a clear statement that cannot be softened later, a truth that future generations are taught as fact, not as controversy. And when that didn't happen cleanly, the fight continued. Not because people love conflict, but because unresolved harm becomes a pressure that never fully dissipates. It just moves from one generation to the next, from survivor testimony to public memory, from memory to textbooks, from textbooks to politics, from politics to denial. And denial, in this context, isn't just an opinion. It's a second injury. Because denial doesn't only erase the past, it attacks the survivor's present. It says, your suffering doesn't count unless we approve it. It says, your pain is negotiable. It says, your life is a courtroom, and you are always on trial. This is why the international pressure grew. Because when a state narrative refuses to settle into accountability, the vacuum fills with global scrutiny. And that brings us to a key moment in the zoom-out escalation: the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2007, the U.S. House passed H.Res. 121, calling on Japan to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept historical responsibility for coercing women into sexual slavery, and urging education to refute denial. Again, this is not the language used for a private matter. This is the language used when the world recognizes a systemic harm that has not been properly closed. And notice what this resolution is really doing beneath the surface. It's not only demanding apology, it's demanding memory management. Because the final stage of any system like this is not what happens during the war. It's what happens in the archive, in the classroom, in the national story. That's why this chapter feels like pressure instead of release. Because it's not just about what happened. It's about what the world decides to remember. And when memory is contested, survivors are forced into a role they never asked for. They become living evidence. They become symbols. They become targets. They become the center of a political storm that treats their trauma like ammunition. This is where the worse-than-death argument becomes undeniable. Not as shock, as structure. Because death ends the argument. But survival forces you to fight for recognition. It forces you to watch people debate whether you deserve belief. It forces you to carry the burden of proof for something you never chose. And it forces you to live long enough to see the world get tired of your pain. That is the second sentence. And it's why the story doesn't end with the war. It ends, if it ends at all, with truth that can't be walked back, with education that can't be diluted, with accountability that can't be outsourced to euphemisms. So here's the clip, because it's the question that exposes the entire structure of the aftermath. If the harm was acknowledged, why does the fight still exist? Justice is a dangerous word in stories like this. Because people hear justice and imagine a clean ending. A verdict, a sentence, a closure. But history rarely offers closure to the people it harms most. History offers something else. a long, exhausting struggle over what the world is willing to admit. And that is why this story, this system, still hasn't settled into the past. Because the war ended, but the argument over memory didn't. And maybe that's the most honest definition of justice in this case. Not a single moment of redemption, but a permanent refusal to let the truth be erased. Because the last violence isn't always physical. Sometimes the last violence is erasure. It's the final stage of the machine. It's what happens when an institution can't fully deny what happened, but it can still try to dissolve it into fog. Complicated, contested, unclear, debated. Words that don't sound like cruelty, but function like it. Words that turn a human catastrophe into an academic shrug. So if we're going to talk about justice, we have to talk about it the way survivors were forced to live it. As something incomplete, as something delayed, as something fought for in slow motion. Because justice here was never just about punishment. It was about recognition, about forcing the world to stop calling a crime by a gentle name. And that brings us back to the opening hook, the lie inside the euphemism. Comfort, the word that pretended to soften what it described, the word that made an organized system sound like a service. Justice begins when that word stops working, when people stop repeating it without hearing what it hides, when language stops protecting power. And the first step toward that kind of justice is always the same. Acknowledgment, not regret, not "we feel sad." Acknowledgment that the system existed and that it involved the military. That is why the Kono Statement matters so much. Because in 1993, Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a statement acknowledging that the comfort stations were established and managed with the involvement of the military authorities, and that in many cases, recruitment was conducted against the women's will through coercion and deception. That is not a rumor. That is not a hostile country's propaganda. That is an official acknowledgement that cracks open the bunker of denial. And once that crack exists, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does a state owe after it admits involvement? This is where justice stops being emotional and becomes structural, because structural harm requires structural repair. And international human rights frameworks have been clear about what repair looks like in cases like this. Disclosure of truth, acknowledgement, apology, education, and accountability. UN documentation and recommendations emphasize precisely these elements. State responsibility, disclosure, apology, education, because the harm was not private. It was tied to a system that demanded a public reckoning. Notice what those recommendations are really saying. They're not only asking for an apology, they're asking for a change in how history is recorded. Because when a system is designed to be deniable, justice has to be designed to be permanent. A private apology can be forgotten. A payment can be reframed. But a public record, taught, documented, preserved, becomes a wall denial can't easily climb. That is why the fight never ended when the war ended. Because what survivors were demanding, in the deepest sense, was not only compassion, they were demanding reality. They were demanding that their lives not be swallowed by a convenient narrative. That is why justice in this story has looked like 5 specific things, none of them perfect, all of them necessary. First, naming the crime accurately, because a euphemism is a form of protection for the system that created it. Second, documentation, not only survivor testimony, but institutional acknowledgement and historical investigation that prevents the topic from being rewritten into ambiguity. Third, education, because denial is strongest when a new generation grows up with no context, no record, no clarity. Fourth, survivor-centered support. Not charity, not pity. Support that treats survivors as human beings, not political tools. Fifth, accountability that doesn't evaporate. Not just statements that can be interpreted, but responsibility that remains consistent over time. And this is where we have to confront the hardest truth of all. Even when acknowledgement exists, institutions often try to keep it contained. They try to admit just enough to reduce pressure, but not enough to create liability. They try to balance truth against reputation. And in that balancing act, justice becomes a negotiation. That is why the aftermath felt like a second war. Because survivors weren't only fighting for help, they were fighting against time, against denial, against the slow decay of memory, against the world's tendency to treat old pain as irrelevant pain. And this is why your role as a viewer matters more than you think. Because in stories like this, there are only three categories of people left once the machine is exposed: the victims, the architects, and the witnesses. You and I weren't there. We didn't build it. We didn't survive it. But we are still part of what happens next. Because what happens next is memory. And memory is where the final battle is fought. That's why the identity lock in this kind of story is so powerful. If you finish this video, you don't just become informed. You become a witness. And a witness has a duty: not to sensationalize, not to exploit, not to reduce human suffering into entertainment, but to refuse erasure. Because the last violence is erasure. The last violence is the world moving on so completely that the victims disappear twice, once from their lives and once from history. So let's close the evidence loop. Cold, clean, undeniable. The UN framing of this issue as military sexual slavery and its recommendations for state responsibility, disclosure, apology, education, and accountability exists as part of documented human rights analysis. The Kono Statement exists as an official acknowledgement of military involvement and coercive recruitment in many cases. That's the spine. That's the record. And that's why the euphemism should never be allowed to do its job again. Because comfort is not a neutral word here. It's a disguise. And disguises are how systems like this survive. Now, here's the final reframing. The one that turns this from a historical story into a warning. This system did not succeed because it was uniquely monstrous. It succeeded because it was organized, because it was routine, because it was made administrative, because it was wrapped in language. And once you understand that, you start to see the most disturbing truth. There are other systems like this. Different names, same machinery, different uniforms, same pipeline, different decade, same euphemisms. Because every era invents new words to make the unacceptable sound normal. And that's the open loop this story leaves you with. If a modern society can argue for decades about what to call a documented wartime system, if it can soften it, contest it, delay it, then what else has been hidden behind gentle language? What other facilities were really prisons? What other relocations were really removals? What other work programs were really exploitation? What other victims are still waiting for the world to stop negotiating their pain? So I'll end this where we began. With a word. Comfort. A word that sounds like kindness, but functions like camouflage. And the only way to defeat camouflage is to name what's underneath it, to document it, to teach it, to remember it. Because the last violence is erasure. And justice, in the end, might simply be this: a world that refuses to forget. Now the question is yours. Should we break down the documents behind another wartime exploitation system next? Non-graphic, research-driven, fully sourced, so we can expose the machinery before euphemisms make it disappear again?